Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
You may be seated. I've always thought today's gospel story is a kind of amusing one. A sweet story about a short man. Zacchaeus, the tax collector, who has a change of heart. But of course, while it is a good story, sometimes the funny, heartwarming aspects of this gospel can keep us from seeing how truly radical it is. In today's gospel, the author of Luke gives us even more detail than usual to let us know just how reprehensible a person Zacchaeus really is. Zacchaeus is not just a tax collector. He's the chief tax collector. He's the tax collector in charge of other tax collectors. We just heard in Aaron's sermon last week, tax collectors were generally understood to be the enforcers of the oppressive Roman taxation system. They were regular people, but they were in league with and paid by the Roman army to collect taxes from their neighbors and friends. They were essentially traitors to their people, and anything that tax collectors collected above the required quota, he got to keep. And Zacchaeus, Luke's gospel points out, is rich. So most likely, Zacchaeus exploited a lot of people. His wealth is almost certainly made off the backs of the poor and at the expense of his own community. As the chief tax collector, it is not too much of a stretch to imagine Zacchaeus as a sort of mob boss running an organization of exploitation that he most especially benefits from. And while it's kind of funny to imagine this guy who is probably used to throwing his weight around, needing to climb a tree in order to see Zacchaeus is, in the moment of his encounter with Jesus, literally looking down on people. It's a powerful metaphor of the way Zacchaeus probably related to his wider community. People look down on Zacchaeus because of his reprehensible actions. He looked down on them as objects of exploitation for his own benefit. And so we start to get a picture of how truly shocking it is that Jesus picks this man, Zacchaeus, out of the crowd. Jesus would have been well within the social and religious parameters of his time to either condemn Zacchaeus as a sinner or else completely ignore him. After all, Zacchaeus literally looks down on everyone else and abuses his position for his own benefit. Zacchaeus would seem to be the antithesis of the kind of person with whom Jesus would want to align himself. But this is where the story gets even more amusing, because for all that Zacchaeus is up a tree and is literally looking down on Jesus, Jesus not only calls Zacchaeus down out of the tree, but then Jesus proceeds to invite himself over to Zacchaeus' house for dinner. Jesus' self-invitation takes some nerve. Would you call the head mob boss out publicly in front of the entire community and then invite yourself over to his house for dinner? Probably not. But that's what Jesus is. And if you ever wanted a prime example of how brave Jesus is, or an example of how Jesus always sees people for who they truly are, rather than as society sees them or even as they see themselves, then today's gospel is a pretty amazing example of this. Undeterred, and probably to the horror of the crowd, Jesus calls Zacchaeus down from the tree and then proceeds to go to his house. So no wonder people grumbled, he's gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner. Jesus' actions are very bold. But here's the thing. Zacchaeus responds to Jesus' invitation to come down from his lofty perch and to welcome Jesus into his home. Zacchaeus does both those things. And the acceptance of this invitation makes all of the difference, it seems, for Zacchaeus. Suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, Zacchaeus has a change of heart, saying, "Look, half my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." The cynics among us might wonder if Zacchaeus is trying to impress Jesus or get in with Jesus somehow by doing this. But Zacchaeus makes this declaration unprompted. And Zacchaeus addresses Jesus as Lord, which implies that Zacchaeus somehow understands who Jesus is. And it feels like an act of faith and not of manipulation. Sometimes we hear this story as Zacchaeus being so moved with guilt and remorse that he chooses to give half his possessions away and repay those he has stolen from. And yes, on one level, some kind of recompense is owed to the community and to the people that Zacchaeus has exploited for so long. But I venture to say that Zacchaeus does not give away his possessions and repay what he has taken out of a feeling of guilt or duty. After all, Jesus doesn't say anything to Zacchaeus about giving his money away. There is no arm twisting or shaming here. All Jesus asks is that Zacchaeus come down from the tree and have Jesus over for dinner. I suspect that the reason Zacchaeus makes this extraordinary declaration of reparation is not out of manipulation or guilt or shame, but out of joy and gratitude, plain and simple. Jesus notices Zacchaeus for who he is, not for what he does, and invites Zacchaeus back into right relationship with his community and with God by inviting himself over for dinner. And the moment that Zacchaeus accepts that invitation to come to Jesus' literal level and not to see himself as above or below where God can reach. And then he finds himself in the presence of God despite all that he has done. Well, that is an incredible and transformative thing. And it is in gratitude for that transformation and restoration to God and community and to his very self. That is why Zacchaeus gives. We kicked off our stewardship season last week, and we asked our shared community to consider making a 9% increase in giving. And that's a lot to ask, I know, in a time of inflation and uncertainty. But don't we also have so much to give thanks to God for? During COVID, we were separated from one another, literally, and also emotionally. Not only could we not gather out of safety concerns, but many of us pulled a little further into ourselves, myself included, either to protect ourselves from the pain of our experience or because we were so exhausted and depleted. We might feel a bit like Zacchaeus, who is so at odds with his sense of community that he feels he needs to climb a tree to set himself even further apart in order to catch a glimpse of God's presence in his life. We've all had to do that in different ways these past years, and we see the fissures of that in our wider collective life. There's an epidemic with loneliness. There's mental health challenges, to say nothing of the national and global political and social divisions in our world. But now, our community, after years of COVID, is being restored to us. We can gather together again, and programs and ministries are coming back or being reimagined and renewed. We can start to make plans for our shared future in ways that we were unable to these last few years. And even though God never left us, we can have shared, palpable experiences of God's presence with us in community once again. like Zacchaeus, we are restored to God and to one another in ways that seem both familiar and wonderfully new. And we invite you to give to the ministry of God at Christ Church for that reason. Out of thanksgiving and joy for what God does for us through this community that we share. That's the invitation that is extended to all of us today. You should get your pledge cards in the mail sometime this week. And we ask that you prayerfully discern what you are able to give and return them to us either by mail or bring them in person for worship on November 13th. Like Jesus calling out to Zacchaeus.